So, one of the big things that we do across several of my modules is a collaborative writing exercise every year in first semester. MA students do it, first years do it, second years are doing a slightly different collaborative exercise. Collaboration is a core value in the digital humanities. And out there in the real world, you don't actually work alone. You work in teams. And now, digitally, it's become important that you be able to work online in teams. Remote working, distributed working, all of these things are now more and more important. So we can show you writings and research papers about how it works in theory, but you need to do it for real. You need to walk the walk. You need to learn how to have serious conversations about text and words in an online format where you're lacking the visual cues that happen in a discussion around a table. We need to experiment with how to use different online tools for course team meetings, small group meetings as well. These are all important skills that we need to acquire. We need to acquire them gently and in an understanding way. So how will this work? People will be encouraged to pick topics from, I call it a list, but it's really very loosely formed, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I will group people into topics, groups of 5 to 7 with a similar interest. Right? No guarantee that everybody will get in perfectly grouped into interests, but more or less, it usually works out. I will set up groups in Canvas. Each group will have its own discussion thread, so you can use that as a focus for collaboration. We have for quite a number of years now used Google Docs for the actual writing part, and it works. So while there are possibly other alternatives open to us, we're going to stick with what we know. And the sequence is that first of all, people will write 400 or 500 words on their chosen topic once we get people in groups. And this will be unstructured writing. It will be done quickly, minimal referencing, stream of consciousness stuff. We just need to generate some text about which we can have some discussions. So then people can share the links to that and read each other's initial drafts. So people can look at, and this is the great thing about Google Docs, it allows you not just to write, but it allows you to comment, to share a document and have comments on it. It allows you to have a conversation down the sidebar in real time as well, or it allows you to open a document in Google Meet, or you can screen share it in other ways as well. So people will read each other's initial drafts, and then each group can, there's a number of different ways by which you can combine the individual pieces into a complete piece of text. So it may be that in some groups, one person will take the lead and produce an initial draft, or people may decide to take, 2 drafts and combine them into one, and 2 others and combine them into one, and then gradually take those 2 and match them in. And an iterative process come down to a text about which you can have a conversation. The final text for each group, the word count will be less than the sum of the initial pieces. So you can't just gunge it all together. There will be a requirement that you do some editing and reduce the size of the total text down to something smaller. And it's also interesting, there's a number of ways which people have discovered over the years that with Google Docs, you can either use different fonts when you're combining, or you can use different colors so you can see what came from where. And I like that because it means I can see how successful groups are at building, not just copying entire paragraphs and putting this paragraph there and that one next and then that one, but actually building paragraphs out of sentences from various sources. So it requires you to think about how you integrate the writing. It requires you to think about writing in a way that you may not necessarily have been required to do so previously, and to do it digitally and online. So it is challenging in that sort of conversation. I don't underestimate the difficulty of that. And over the steps of that process, eventually you will come up with a final product. Normally we do this in the last 4 weeks of the semester. This semester I want to start it earlier and have a longer run at it for obvious reasons. Because it is group work and it is a little bit harder in the normal circumstances. When I form people into groups, we have face-to-face classes, I can turn around at the end of a class and say, right, we're not, the last half hour of today's class is you get together in your groups. Not so easy to do online. So we have a whole extra layer of practical, experiential learning. But certainly Google Docs works, it allows remote editing, and there are a variety of meeting tools. As I said, Google Meet, Microsoft Teams, ways in which people and groups can organize times to get together, to have discussions. And how far you need to actually have all the faces on screen talking about the text, and maybe for some groups it's easier for people. Some people are more comfortable just putting marginal comments because they do text editing as a solitary thing. So it's going to be interesting for groups to work out what their favorite modalities of working is, and how in a team do you manage these different styles of working. This is a really important part of team working. Planning a major, I'm responsible for running a major event next year, and I have two different sorts of people on my committee, the planners and the pantsers, who would normally in a physical event show up on the Friday evening of the convention and, just do it. So these are things that and the only way you can do this is by having a go at it. So the dynamics, the experience is what's important here. But what usually happens is that the words that come out at the end are really good, actually. So the question is, how do we find topics briefly? So there's a big list of topics that has emerged over the years, and I'll make sure that this is available in all the modules where we're doing this. And in fact, those topics, there's some duplication on the list as we built it up and threw things together for years. And some of them were suggested by people in classes, and it was quite unusual to see some of them come up. And some of them grouped together in various ways. So that list is there, and some of them are topics that I deal with in my own teaching, and some are ones that I'd love to get to, but we just don't have the time. But I think this being the year that it is, I am interested to see how the topics address the situation we find ourselves in. How can digital tools help us to understand and address and chart a future course in, through, and around this year's major event, which is, of course, the COVID pandemic. And that touches a number of areas. It touches, obviously, working and learning from home, and how this works, and how we will deal with things like remote working, or hubs, the emergence of remote working hubs in places all over the country, the use of schools as network nodes. You've all seen the picture of people, I no doubt, who had to drive, and 3 or 4 people for remote working had to sit in their cars outside a church in West Cork because that was where they got the best network connection. The idea of e-villages, as people move out of the cities and they want village communities where they have more connectivity. And also how will things like robots and automation, how far will robots and automation, for example, replace frontline workers and remove people from risk? How will that change the way in which we approach the questions of robots and accommodation? There's an area as well which comes up occasionally of things like sports. And the big thing, which is ridiculously expensive, is the whole Peloton phenomenon during the lockdown and remote exercising. Gyms were closed, so and this leads to things like esports. How will esports and gaming online become a substitute or develop instead of traditional sports? How far will virtual reality replace contact sports? There's an issue. There are issues in politics and international relations. There is the whole question. The pandemic has fundamentally changed the nature of, for instance, the global supply chain and globalization, and that has an impact in international relations and how states and nations behave towards one another. Because we have now seen digital diplomacy, massively accelerated. International conferences now take place on Zoom. rather than face-to-face, and that changes the nature. And people have reported on how this changes the nature of the meeting experience and the relationship between the heads of state and how they interact online versus in face-to-face conferences. But of course, there's also a deeper issue in international relations, which is the two major points of view. One is the idea that an international order, the liberal view, that what is important is an international order based on the rule of law and cooperation. This is particularly important for sharing knowledge about the virus. It's fundamental how the World Health Organization works on the basis of open science and sharing. There is, again, on the other hand, there's the other view in international relations, which is called the realist school, summarized in Hedley Bull's book, The Anarchic Society, which is the dog-eat-dog, in which people, at the very sharp end, contend for access to supplies of vaccines, contend and compete for access to supplies of personal protective garments. So, I mean, this is a question in international relations. How do states behave towards one another in the world community? And it also affects domestic politics. And it has translated in a number of ways into how domestic political leaders behave. Not just so, even within states. And we've seen this, for example, in the context of the discussions about Manchester and Northern Ireland. Whether central government will provide supports for regions which have to go into lockdown and how far they will support them. As well, of course, as the impact on the other thing that's happening, which is the whole idea of a Green New Deal and the transition to a post-carbon society and the 2050 deadline, which is increasingly emerging for a zero carbon world. And how do those things fit together? How do we envisage a future? What is the role of digital tools at two levels? One, in allowing us to envisage and engage in activism or clicktivism to get towards that end. And the other is, what is the nuts and bolts way in which digital tools can actually allow us? What is the role for digital tools, not just in scientific research, to advance all of these important issues? The Green New Deal, the vaccine, pandemic preparedness, which is something that undoubtedly we must think about for the future again. So there's a number of layers at which digital tools in the future. The question will be, what is the role of the digital? And how do you, as people working in the digital field, with nominally some expertise, how do you contribute to this? So I think I'd like to see people think in terms of topics like that, and try and shape the writing around topics like that, because I think these are major issues that we need to concern ourselves with, and I don't necessarily expect that these pieces of collaborative writing will provide definitive and earth-shattering solutions or answers to any of the questions of the relationship between the digital and what we might call the current problématique, as academics have been wont to describe it. But they will help people to define the field and start shaping out and feeling out, what is the scope of the debate, and how can we use digital tools to have profound and serious knowledge conversations about topics of contemporary relevance. On the one hand, they're a great set of topics and a great area to talk about because there is no predefined set of solutions. This is about future studies. It is about envisaging a future where there's a great landscape of possibilities which we can seize to build the future that we want. There is a phrase, you create your own reality. What you put out in the world comes back and shapes the reality in which you live. So as digital professionals in the future, you need to start thinking about how you will use your skills with digital tools and digital leadership to help get us out of the mess in which we currently are, and using these topics as, the topics on which to anchor our collaborative writing exercise this year allows us to explore that. So it means it's useful on several levels. The practical, the praxis of how we do this, and also to have conversations about things which are actually important now and for the future. So I will set up discussion threads in the relevant classes where people can post a 1 or 2 line suggestion of the areas they're interested in, and I will then try and shuffle people into groups on that basis. And when I have done that, I will then establish a timeline over the rest of the semester for kicking it off and going through the various stages. And obviously, as we go along in the second half of the semester, because this requires a lot of time, the reading load tends to A, focus on collaborative work, and B, lessen down a little bit, because every week this will take some of your time.